Hi, and welcome back to the Video Games and Geography video series. In the last episode, I laid a foundation for geography and video games through the concept of landscapes. In this episode, I will build further on this notion of landscape, but this time more specifically by focusing on post-apocalyptic landscapes that we find in video games. One of the key findings of the last episode was the notion that video games are not autonomous, and I mean in the sense that they reflect cultural values. And I believe that post-apocalyptic virtual landscapes are representative of certain societal anxieties. And in order to elaborate this, I have some examples. I have categorized the post-apocalyptic video game landscape into 3 different types that I believe represent different anxieties. So first there is the ecological disaster scenario, secondly the zombie outbreak scenario, and lastly the wasteland/ruin scenario. So firstly, there's the anxiety of global ecological disaster in the age of the Anthropocene. As human activity leaves a bigger and bigger imprint on the planet, ecological consequences now become more tangible, for example in the form of rising sea levels. Daniel Chernilo points out that the key factor in the Anthropocene narrative is that it is ethnocentric or anthropocentric, so it places humanity at the center of everything. With that notion come both dystopian and utopian ideas. The Anthropocene narrative is dystopian in the sense that it comes with massive anxiety about prospects of the end of the human race, in which the planet, through ecological disaster, becomes no longer inhabitable for humanity. The utopian ideas come to the fore through ideas of human technological mastery. In other words, there's the idea that humanity will be able to remedy climate change through innovation, not for the sake of the planet itself, but for the sake of the survival of the human race. Now, luckily for game developers, these utopian and dystopian ideas both translate very effectively into game design. The dystopian aspect engages the player as they find themselves in the landscape of ruins. It piques curiosity as the player wants to uncover what happened that turned the landscape to ruins. The utopian aspect is where the labor aspect from last episode comes in. The player must use skill and resourcefulness to master the environment and bend it to their will. So the game that is currently being shown on screen is called Subnautica, and in Subnautica the player finds himself in such a flooded world, in an underwater alien world that is filled with both danger and wonder. And the player must survive somehow in this harsh environment by collecting resources and crafting equipment, and work towards technological innovations such as advanced diving and drilling equipment in order to master the environment and extract its resources. Another example of a video game where the player finds himself in a flooded world is Raft. In Raft, you spawn in the middle of the ocean on, well, as the name suggests, a small raft. The situation seems desperate. You have nothing but a few planks of wood holding your raft together and the clothes on your body. Luckily, and also very ironically, the ocean is heavily polluted with plastic and other components, supplying the player with much needed resources. The player can use plastic and other parts like metal to craft tools such as a fishing rod, while they can use building materials such as wood to expand the raft. The goal is ultimately to turn the raft into a comfortable home where the player can survive. What Subnautica and Raft share in common, besides the setting of a flooded world, is that the narrative is secondary. There are bits and pieces of the lore to be found, but ultimately the story is left to the interpretation of the player. Furthermore, the games are survival oriented. The main premise is for the player to survive in what is largely considered an uninhabitable environment. Furthermore, the games take inspiration from both the dystopia and utopia of the Anthropocene. So, if we can take the example from Raft, the tiny starting raft that you've seen at the start of the clip would be dystopian, and after many hours of playing, I've turned it into a comfortable home that is now a utopia. Now, aside from simply being fun to play, These games provide an excellent insight into the Anthropocene debate, as such prospects of learning to survive in a world plagued by floodings and rising sea levels are already heavily imprinted in people's minds. In a book by Elizabeth de Lafrey called Allegories of the Anthropocene, de Lafrey presents the flooded world as the new frontier. Just like the pilgrims heading west in the Americas and learning to thrive in a new and harsh environment, humanity is now learning to do the same on a rising sea. De Lafrey mentions the relatively new concept of seasteading, homes on the ocean only available to those with very deep pockets. While the conversation of climate mitigation is happening in one corner of the room, in the opposite corner, humanity is already preparing for the inevitable destruction of the planet. And through video games, it is already possible to experience these doomsday scenarios through a virtual environment.
Let's see if I can improve your looks.
The zombie world. Now, I was originally hesitant to include this type of game because they seem a bit too goofy or campy, but in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought this category of games deserved a mention. Now, I'm fully aware that COVID-19 didn't exactly turn people into brain-eating zombies, but there's an argument to be made here. Just like the anxiety concerning natural disaster, there's an anxiety concerning our biological vulnerability. What I mean by this is that despite all the medical innovations that we have, we know deep down that we can never truly control natural factors such as disease. This perceived powerlessness destabilizes the view of humanity's ability to master the world through technology, and thus translates into anxiety. The zombie genre of video games plays off this fear, putting the players into worlds that have become inhabitable, not due to flooding as in the previous example, but due to the outbreak of some kind of virus. On screen is shown that island, but I will not be elaborating on any specific examples because these games they pretty much all come down to the same thing. They build off the same premise. The player must manage to survive in a now uninhabitable world that has been destroyed by disease. Just as we had to figure out how to keep our economies and social lives running throughout the COVID pandemic. So the final category of video games I want to present in this episode is the wasteland scenario. And this type of game has actually been studied quite extensively. It has gotten a lot of attention in academia, for example the Fallout series. And I found one such article by Emma Fraser. In her article, she likens post-apocalyptic cultural imaginaries to those found in post-apocalyptic video games. So, just for a bit of context, in the Fallout series, the developers suggest an alternative history in which in the 1950s a nuclear war broke out between the USA and China, after which they nuked each other and the planet was basically reduced to rubble. Now, this is a type of anxiety that was the hallmark of the Cold War era, where the USA and the Soviet Union were threatening each other with nukes, threatening to make large chunks of the planet uninhabitable. Just as in the age of the Anthropocene currently, humanity was already preparing for the doomsday scenario. But rather than seasteading homes, they built bunkers. And just as Subnautica and Raft give us insight into how it could be living in a flooded world, Fallout lets the player experience life in a ruined world. The ruined city or the scorched wasteland is ideal for game developers. Not only does it demand intrigue because it represents something people are actively afraid of, a fragmented landscape also presents the player with plenty of opportunity for exploration and challenge. I argue here that the dystopian aspect that we find in the Anthropocene narrative presents the initial intrigue of the game, so whatever makes the landscape scary or interesting, so something that makes it demand the player's attention. And the utopian aspect comes from the challenge presented to the player, in which a productive playing environment is created. Now, in the game that is shown on screen, Fallout New Vegas, for example, the world is filled with things to do for the player. as they have to somehow untangle this chaos that is in the landscape. This includes, for example, quests to reunite families, free slaves, or even things like fixing water filtering systems. The player must basically start from nothing and make a name for themselves, improving their reputation with the citizens of the wasteland. To make a callback to the last episode, the post-apocalyptic wasteland, despite being barren, demands constant labor. In conclusion, I have highlighted the three different tropes of the flooded world, the zombie world, and the ruined world to further elaborate on how virtual landscapes reflect cultural values by representing humanity's existential anxieties. Furthermore, when these anxieties are translated into a virtual landscape, they become utopian rather than dystopian, as the ruined landscape is to be exploited and mastered by the player. In this sense, the feeling of anxiety, through labor, becomes a feeling of triumph. As video games do not suffer from the same risks that the real world poses, virtual environments let the player experience these catastrophic landscapes in a controlled environment. This can even have therapeutic value, as we can simulate our fears and anxiety in a digital space and face them, learning how to better manage them. And that marks the end of the second episode in my geography and video game series. In the next episode, we will investigate how contemporary game culture relates to the legacy of the imperialist imagination. Of interest are action-adventure and strategy games, and how their design of exploration and exploitation of exotic environments tie in with colonial imaginations. See you in the next one.